For a long time in wrestling, the heels were the people fans hated and wanted to see get beat more than anything else. But at some point along the line, something happened and we entered the era of bad guys being likable, even cool in some situations. And when that happened, incidents began popping up of audiences getting behind the villains even when they weren't supposed to. But what are the biggest examples of this taking place? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now, starting with perhaps the most famous example of all, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, it's easy to forget now if you weren't around at the time, but back before Steve Austin became arguably the biggest babyface in wrestling history during the late 90s and early 2000s, his character was initially presented as that of a dastardly heel. But then this makes sense when you consider the fact that all he did back then was cheat and stab people in the back at a moment's notice, traits which were typical of a villain at this point in time, or at any point in time for that matter. So why did fans start cheering for the Rattlesnake in spite of all this? Well, as the late 90s were dawning, the anti-hero suddenly became the cool thing in pop culture. After all, this was the era of musicians such as Eminem, games like Grand Theft Auto, and TV shows like South Park. So because of that feeling being in the air, it became impossible to hate Austin, as every week he just came across as so cool and his complete disregard for the rules, especially when placed in comparison to the rest of the roster, many of whom were still living in the New Generation era. Where would this all lead? Well, it would lead to a formal babyface turn for Steve at WrestleMania 13, during what to this day might still be the greatest match in WWE history, and one of the greatest matches ever in general, when he refused to tap out to Bret Hart while locked in the sharpshooter. And from there, it was off to the races as Stone Cold became the face of the Attitude Era, WWF's second great boom period. Come 2001 though, the boom period would be over, largely because Austin had decided to turn heel at WrestleMania 17, a move no one was excited about seeing. So little would fans be interested in this new heel turn for their hero. In fact, many would keep cheering for the Rattlesnake anyway, no matter how dastardly he got. But then, how could they be expected to do anything different when it was one of those dastardly acts which first got him so over back in late 1996? No, there was just no way you were going to get fans to turn on Austin at any point post his rise to the top of the card. And even if you could, 2001 would have been a failure in that respect anyway, as he was just too entertaining whenever he was taking part in backstage comedy segments with Kurt Angle and Vince McMahon. But what of another name we mentioned a moment ago, a famous rival to Steve Austin? Didn't they have an iconic heel turn which saw them be cheered by a large part of the audience too? Why, yes they did, and that's why our next subject is Bret Hart in 1997. Now this was a pretty unique situation, even by the standards of heels getting cheered, as after turning to the dark side following his match against Stone Cold at WrestleMania 13, the Hitman would take a different route with his new heel path. What would that route be? Well, given he still saw himself as the babyface in his home country of Canada, the only country which mattered as far as he was concerned, he would continue to play to that audience whenever WWF did shows there over the course of the spring and summer which followed. Obviously then, this led to the Canadian fans continuing to cheer for Bret, as to them, he really was still their hero, who had arguably done nothing wrong. No, the real villains in this situation as far as they were concerned were Americans like Steve Austin. And so it was then that a truly bizarre time arose for WWF during what to this day might still be considered their best year creatively, as whenever Raw emanated from the United States, Hart and his family would be jeered at every turn, and whenever they went north of the border, they'd be treated like the ultimate babyfaces. Sure, there have been other examples of wrestlers being treated like heroes in their hometowns despite being dastardly heels, but Bret Hart in Canada during 1997 felt different, as it was the first time such a thing had been done on such a large scale. Really, it all got to a point where this US versus Canada war became the main story anchoring the entire promotion. Then of course there was the events of the Montreal Screwjob a few months later, which only further solidified Bret as an eternal babyface in Canada. But let's move away from WWE for now and over to WCW instead, as it's there that a famous example of heels getting cheered predates the two we've looked at already. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the NWO. Now it's important to make clear just how game-changing this one was when it happened, because, at least in North America, nothing had ever been really seen like it before. Sure, there had been invasion angles in certain territories throughout the era, but nothing on the scale of what WCW would do starting in 1996. Why was that? Well, this one involved taking two of WWF's biggest stars and combining them with the face of the entire industry during the 80s to create a heel supergroup that actually felt like it would take over the company. More so than anything else, though, it was the heel turn of Hulk Hogan here which really caught people's attention, as it was about as shocking of a moment as you could have gotten back in the mid-90s. So, with all this in mind then, is it any surprise that fans quickly started seeing the NWO as the cool faction in the whole situation? As acting more like a street gang than anything else, they completely tore up the script of what American TV wrestling was and rewrote it as they saw fit. Backstage segments where they created chaos around the production truck? Check. Hijacking the show at random intervals? Check. Hell, so much would the New World Order dominate WCW television here, and so cool would they look in doing so, at a certain point it became impossible for fans to boo them. Of course, this did create a problem for the company in the long run though, because once the heel group got too over as unintentional babyfaces, it made the real babyface side look pretty weak by comparison. And that meant it was often difficult to get the dynamics right, as whenever the supposed good guys entered the fray, fans were often a lot less interested in them than they were people like the outsiders. Hell, by the time 1997 came around, Sting aside, you were pretty uncool if you were part of Team WCW. And that was evidenced in the fact that you couldn't walk around a schoolyard here without seeing at least a few kids wearing NWO t-shirts. So in the long run, it could be argued that this was an example of a heel act getting so over with fans they ended up getting cheered, it became detrimental to the company overall, as it became too hard for them to go back to a classic babyface formula after the fact. Hell, it would be one of the many reasons why WCW went under in 2001. But that wouldn't be the end for Hulk Hogan, of course. No, from there he'd jump back over to WWF again, this time as a heel. And once he was there, he would prove to be so over with that audience too, he'd get cheered all over again. Really though, we should have all seen this coming, as despite returning to WWE at No Way Out in February of 2002 alongside his original NWO stablemates Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, ostensibly as a heel group who were looking to inject the WWE with a lethal dose of poison, just as they ultimately had done with WCW toward the end, it was always going to be the case that at least one member of this trio got cheered before long. After all, for that generation of fans, they were the original cool heels. What no one could have foreseen, however, was how this would all go down, as it would be at WrestleMania 18 that things took a dramatic turn in terms of who audiences were behind. What happened here? Well, this was the night where, after a month of terrorizing the WWF locker room in an attempt to get fans to hate them, the NWO walked into the showcase of the Immortals ready to take out the top two babyfaces in the company. But while Scott Hall would have no problems getting booed in his match against Steve Austin earlier on in the night, toward the close of the show the same could not be said for Hollywood Hogan during his bout against The Rock. No, despite The Rock arguably being at the peak of his popularity here, he was no match for the power of nostalgia, as once Hogan arrived at the Skydome that night, the same building where he'd memorably fought the Ultimate Warrior 12 years prior, he was treated like a returning hero. That's right, so much would the live crowd be into Terry Bollea here, they'd even boo the Great One himself whenever he got some offense in. And that led to Vince McMahon actually calling an audible at the gorilla position when he sent out Hall and Nash after the bout was over to turn on the Hulkster, in the process formally completing his abrupt babyface turn. Why had fans decided to react that way to the heel on this evening? Well, like we said a moment ago, nostalgia is a powerful drug. So powerful is it, in fact, it led to everyone in the building here suddenly being transported to their childhood just for a little while. And once they were transported back to that childhood then, there was no way they were going to boo their childhood hero. No, this was Hulk Hogan, the man who'd probably gotten most of them into wrestling in the first place. Really, the whole thing got so intense that just 1 month later, the Hulkster would be the undisputed champion as, for a short period that spring, heel alignments were thrown out the window and Hulkamania was allowed to run wild for a little while again. That said, there was a time when Hogan was on the opposite side of this dynamic, as it would be in 1992 that he'd find himself going up against a heel who was getting cheered in the form of our next subject, Sid. Sid Justice, Sid Vicious, Psycho Sid. The softball aficionado who goes by the shoot name of Sid Udy has had many different monikers while inside of a wrestling ring. And most of the time he's been in that ring, he's been playing the role of a heel, something which came easy to him on account of his imposing size. Seriously, if you were to make the ideal physique for a wrestler, particularly in the 80s, then Sid might be it. On occasion, though, something about his look and natural charisma saw fans decide to get behind him even when he was supposed to be the villain, with the first notable example of this happening at the 1992 Royal Rumble. What happened here? Well, this was the night where a lot of fans finally decided they were tired of Hulk Hogan's shtick. So when he was very fairly eliminated from the titular Battle Royal by Sid toward the end of the bout, they popped big. Yes, for the simple reason that he'd gotten rid of Terry Bollea, the Washington native suddenly became the biggest babyface in WWF for a brief moment. And this continued on to some degree all the way through the subsequent build to the pair's showdown at WrestleMania 8, by which point it was clear audiences no longer wanted to see the Hulkster on top. But that wasn't the only time Sid would get over with the crowd ahead of a top babyface, despite being the villain. No, fast forward a few years to late 1996 and the exact same thing would happen again. Except this time it wasn't Hulk Hogan who audiences were turning on in favor of the big man, rather, it was Shawn Michaels. That said, come late 1996, it was getting very easy to hate the Heartbreak Kid because despite being positioned as the top face in WWF, his natural bad attitude at that time couldn't help but radiate through the screen. And this set the table for Survivor Series that year. Yes, it was at this event where a traditionally raucous WWF crowd housed within Madison Square Garden decided that Sid was their guy. So when he came out to one of the coolest entrances in living memory, he was treated like an absolute god as fans fist bumped him all the way down to the ring, all while he loudly asked each and every one of them who the man was. Of course, given it was the Big Apple, it's perhaps less of a surprise Sid got such a reaction here, then an even bigger one when he eventually beat HBK to win the WWF title. After all, this is the same crowd who first started the trend of cheering for Steve Austin that same evening. But let's move away from the men for now and over to the women instead, as it's there we find our next subject, someone else who got cheered by fans despite being a heel. Who are we talking about here? Why, Rhea Ripley, of course. Now, we should make it clear here we're talking about Rhea Ripley during her run as part of the Judgment Day. Obviously today she's supposed to be a babyface, but back then, when she was arguably the leader of the heel faction, fans weren't meant to get behind her. No, if anything, the Eradicator was supposed to be the big bully heel of the entire women's division at this point, someone who could destroy any of the ladies that were put against her, all before she then beat up some of the men too for good measure. But then something happened. Fans started getting into Rhea. Why was this? Well, there were a few reasons. Firstly, there was the fact that in beating up a bunch of the men, the Australian just came off as really cool, someone who it was hard to boo after a while. And on top of that, there was also her look, a goth dominatrix look which appealed to people who both thought she was badass and who just had a crush on her. Really, there was a big rock star vibe to Rhea as the 2020s got into full swing, and this all created a situation where, even if she was the heel, it didn't feel like it. More so than either of those reasons we mentioned already, however, perhaps the biggest reason Rhea Ripley got so over in a babyface fashion around 2022 was because of her on-screen relationship with Dominik Mysterio, a relationship which started out with her manipulating him to do her bidding at all times and which eventually evolved into more of a romance. As you would expect then, like with other great heel double acts before them, it became hard not to enjoy the segments Rhea and Dom had here. And so it was that before long, Ripley had pretty much been turned babyface, as despite technically being on the side of the villains, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in the audience on any given night who wasn't cheering for her. Understandably then, after a while, the former Women's World Heavyweight Champion would turn face formally, with this happening after she was kicked out of the Judgment Day by her stablemates, Dominik Mysterio included. And from that point on, she'd remained on the side of the good guys, as at this point, there's no one who wants to boo her. But what about the other side to that coin, the yin to her yang if you will, Dirty Dom? We already talked a little bit about him in this entry, but he's someone who's deserving of an entry of their own, as he too is someone who at various points has gotten over in babyface fashion, despite being a heel. Sure, during the early years of Dom's rise up the card, it would be the cool thing to do to boo him. In fact, booing the kayfabe son of Eddie Guerrero became a part of the show itself after a while. But even then, there was a sense of irony to the jeers that the San Diego native was receiving here, as most kind of liked his scummy heel character. Come on now, it was hard to truly hate him when he was complaining about things like doing hard time after spending a single night in jail. And it was even harder to do so once his on-screen relationship with his mommy, Rhea Ripley, fully blossomed. Once Dominik kicked Rhea to the curb in favor of Liv Morgan though, it seemed like he was really the most despised man on the roster for a while. And then something happened. What was this? Well, at WrestleMania 41, the Mysterio one went into his Intercontinental title match against Finn Balor, Penta, and Braun Breaker as the unexpected babyface of the situation. And this all led to him getting a huge pop when he left with the gold that night. Quite a turn-up for the books, given where the character had been up until then. And those cheers have continued over the months which followed because, despite still technically being a heel, it's not uncommon to hear fans get behind Dirty Dom at live shows now. Sure, there will still be a good amount of boos in there too, but again, these are almost being done as a sign of love for him now, similar to the way people chanted "You suck" at Kurt Angle back during the 2000s. And if you go down to Mexico, where Mysterio currently stands as the AAA Mega Champion, it's almost unanimous adoration for the man who's pretty much conquered that promotion in record time. Basically, what we're saying here is that as things stand today, it feels like only a matter of time until Dom formally turns babyface. And when that does happen, we hope he keeps the weaselier aspects of his character, as it's these which got him so over in the first place as a lovable rogue, much in the same way it did for Eddie Guerrero once upon a time. Really, we're not saying Dom is as good as Eddie or anything, but the spirit of his lying, cheating, and stealing character might be the closest thing we've got to Latino heat in modern-day WWE. But Dominik Mysterio isn't the only modern-day WWE star who found himself getting over with fans as a result of being quite simply too lovable to boo, despite being a heel. No, there's a perhaps even more notable example of this that we haven't talked about yet, one who played a large part in the company getting hot again in 2022 with his role in the Bloodline. And that person is none other than our next subject, Sami Zayn. Yes, given the subject of today's video, it was inevitable we were going to get here eventually because, again, Sami Zayn's character work in 2022 and 2023 is a big part of the reason WWE got hot again. After all, it was his antics as the honorary Uce trying to worm his way into the Bloodline which first caught the attention of many lapsed fans once more and caused them to return to the fold. How did this angle all play out? Well, after trying to form an on-screen friendship with the Usos in the spring of 2022, by the time the summer of that same year came around, the French-Canadian would be appearing in segments alongside Roman Reigns too. And while he was supposed to be a heel here, as were the rest of the Bloodline too for that matter, it very quickly became impossible to boo Sami, partially because he's such a nice guy in real life, and this just radiated through the screen every time he was on it. Even more so than that though, it was his childlike wonder and hangdog expressions which were on full display, as each week he came a little bit closer to becoming a full member of the villainous faction. Hell, if you want to look at the Ground Zero segment for WWE's hot streak of 2022 to 2024, then the Feeling Oozy segment from the November 25th, 2022 episode of SmackDown might be it, as that was such a fantastic moment, it couldn't help but get people interested. And when people tuned in here and saw what Zayn was doing, they instantly fell in love with him. Where would this take him? Well, inevitably, all this would lead to Sami turning babyface at the following January's Royal Rumble. And from there, he'd go on to become one of the most beloved heroes of the entire promotion, with this being a status he maintains as of the time of this video's recording. Sure, he's yet to win that elusive world title on the main roster, but at this point, it feels like that's an inevitability. And he might never have reached this stage had it not been for that heel run as part of the Bloodline, which first turned him face and got him so over with audiences both in attendance and watching on TV. Of course, similar things could be said about another notable faction in WWE's history too though, as they first started out as a heel act only to then get increasing cheers from the audience every week. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Degeneration X? Now, we should be clear here, when we're talking about Degeneration X, we're talking about the original incarnation, not the Triple H-led one of 1998, as that one was always supposed to be a babyface faction. And when this version of the stable reformed in late 1999 as a heel act, there was never any cheers for them. No, what we're talking about here is the group first formed by Triple H and Shawn Michaels in late 1997, the one which also included Chyna, and for a little while at least, Rick Rude. Why is it this version of DX we're talking about here? Well, despite very much being a heel group, it didn't take long for them to get cheered by fans. And the reason for that was because, even if they were positioned as the big bad of the promotion here, the ones standing in the way of top babyface acts like Stone Cold Steve Austin, they were too cool to boo. Yes, whenever DX came out to the ring, you knew you were going to get a segment which was going to push the boundaries of good taste. And back in 1997, that was exactly what audiences wanted to see, as this was very much the era of the anti-hero. seriously, there wasn't a world of difference between the Degenerates and Steve Austin at this point in time in terms of the anti-authority gimmicks they had. But unlike Stone Cold in 1997, Shawn Michaels and Triple H were able to add a lot more goofy and risque humor to the entire thing too. Come on now, there's a reason it's this version of Degeneration X which is most often brought back in revivals, and that's because it was the original and best one, the one which set the template for everything else which was to come, and which allowed for the 1998 incarnation to become formal babyfaces at all. Really, while they weren't the ones responsible for creating the Attitude Era, no, the vast majority of this era's creation can be put down to the Rattlesnake catching fire like no one else had before, DX did play a big role in shaping what the turn of the millennium period would look like. So it's no surprise fans loved them then, even when they were supposed to be booing them, as they represented a changing of the guard. But let's move away from WWE for a moment and over to the real punk rock company of the 90s, the promotion which laid the original groundwork for the boom period of that era to come, Extreme Championship Wrestling. Why is that? Because it's there we find our next subject, another heel who fans loved, Rob Van Dam. Okay, for this one, we're going to need you to cast your minds back to the mid to late 90s again, though this time over in Philadelphia instead of WWE. That's where, in a little renegade promotion known as ECW, a young Rob Van Dam was first making a name for himself. And the way he was doing this was by putting on some incredible matches featuring a highly innovative martial arts offense, one which saw him come out the winner of the match more often than not. Obviously then, this made RVD very popular with the Philly faithful over at the 2300 Arena. Seriously, there was a period where he was probably the most popular act on the entire roster, and that's pretty impressive when you consider the fact that throughout his ECW run, Van Dam was technically meant to be a heel. Sure, his in-ring work was very babyface-esque, but every time he picked up a mic and berated the fans, claiming he was just waiting for an offer from either WWF or WCW so he could split and take the money, it made it clear that he wasn't on the audience's side, whether they liked it or not. But as we mentioned already, this did nothing to stop that audience from cheering for Mr. Monday Night. No, he was just too good to not get behind. After all, this was a man who was doing things many of those fans had never seen before, things like his signature Van Terminator move. So it was then that rather than being the guy who was looking to screw ECW over by leaving them in the dust as soon as a better money offer came along, Rob Van Dam ended up turning into one of the pillars of the company, a true symbol of the very identity it had as an anti-establishment outsider when it was at its peak. Needless to say then, this fan support of RVD would continue on for years thereafter as he joined the likes of WWE and TNA, becoming a top babyface act in each at various points. That said, he was arguably never better than he was back when he was in his original home of Extreme Championship Wrestling. And the reason for this was because that was when he had the most edge, something which was afforded to him by the fact he was still a heel, just one who fans loved. But then the same thing could be said about many of the other people we've looked at today, as they all arguably peaked when they were the lovable villains. We guess it just goes to show then, sometimes it pays to be bad in the wrestling industry.